Hello, AP World History students. Mr. Lassiter here with you tonight on Fiveable, taking a look at another part of this big AP World Modern curriculum. Today, already somebody can't hear. Uh-oh. All right, let me see what the matter is. All right, I'm getting input. Let's see. All right, we're going to try that now. How we doing volume there? Some people can hear, some people can't, so we're going to try that. And then I'm going to try to our mic. If you can't hear now, check your settings, because I've moved over trying to. All right, we have some people who can still hear. Maya can't hear right now. Maybe somebody who's in the chat can give some advice there. Sometimes closing out the window and reopening it and rejoining might be able to help us. But we're going to go ahead and keep going as long as most everybody can hear. We can deal with false starts here on Fiveable. That's how you know it's live, right? And we're doing it as it go. So what we're going to be looking at tonight are these things called labor systems. This is, I'm going to say up front, before we get started, before I get into everything great that we have coming up over the course of this week, this is one of my favorite topics, though it is one that if you just say it, labor systems, sounds pretty boring. I'm going to say that right up front, but it is, I think, fascinating to think about the changes that take place in the time period we're going to be talking about today, which is 1450 to 1750. So we're going to spend some time thinking about these labor systems and different aspects. Tonight, we're going to be thinking about how a question is crafted, how you might get an LEQ or maybe even a DBQ on this topic, how we go about thinking about what the College Board uses to craft these questions, and then how do we go about answering them. And so we'll look at the many different ways that you can use the content of the course to go about answering a specific question today. So I'm going to go ahead and shrink down into the corner, or one of these directions, and we will begin this presentation. We're focusing on labor systems in the early modern world. So that's what we're thinking about. Early modern, we're talking about the time period from 1450 to 1750. This was the old period 4 in the previous framework. It is unit 4 is what we're focusing on here, and probably the second time period that you're in, unless you did time period 0, which would be fantastic. A couple reminders of what we have going. Remember to follow Fiveable on Twitter and Instagram and YouTube. Feel free to follow me at Wapters on Twitter. You get the, I'm constantly retweeting Mr. Beckman, who's in the chat tonight, letting you know what the newest information or the newest streams that we're going to be having are. This week, we have a lot of really great streams coming. Later tonight, if you're a night owl, or if you just happen to be further west than I am, I'm here on the East Coast. Tonight at 9 p.m. Pacific, which means midnight here on the East Coast, Allie Thiessen will be presenting on religion and early modern empires. And if you can't stay up that late, definitely think about getting that Fiveable membership, because then you will be able to watch the replay when you wake up tomorrow. I know first thing in the morning, that's what you want to do. Some other events that are coming later this week. Tomorrow, Expanding Empires in the Early Modern World with Donald. Answering short answer questions on the 17th with Caroline. And then one that we have Oh, and I want to mention in Allie and Donald, they're also reviewing topics from Unit 3 with land-based empires in their unit. So if you haven't quite finished up Unit 3, those are some that you might want to check out. Caroline on the 17th with short answer questions, she's going to have original questions for you to practice. So if you need more examples, you've already gone through everything the College Board offers or that your teacher has, join for that stream. You'll get a lot of good original content. On the 17th at 11 p.m. Eastern and 8 p.m. Out on the Pacific coast, you're going to see Melissa. She's going to talk about travelers' tales of the late Middle Ages. And that's going to talk about people like Ibn Battuta and Marco Polo, but it's also going to deal with Marguerite Kemp. And I'm not even sure if I'm pronouncing it right, because that's a brand new addition to the key concepts this year, to the course and exam description. So really interesting. If you want to get a little bit more information on that, then definitely join. That is a reschedule, and it's actually from back in Unit 2. I had to be rescheduled from last week. So definitely, Melissa is excellent. Definitely make sure to log in for that one. And then on coming up on the 20th, the end of this week, we have a live student study group with Varun and Shruti. So lots of options to engage with your fellow classmates and with other teachers here on Fiveable for topics that you need or that maybe you don't know you need quite yet. So just kind of keep those in mind. If you want to save your spot for an upcoming live review, right down there at the bottom, of course, now I'm in a corner, so I don't really know which way I should be pointing. You should click on that call to action and make sure that you save your spot for that upcoming live review. All right, so we're going to go ahead and move on, push on with this presentation. But again, I don't want to leave these other ones out because there's really a lot of great content this year here on Fiveable, and it is constant and there for you. So let's go ahead and get started thinking about what we're doing tonight. As I said, this is on labor systems in the early modern era, and we're going to approach this from the viewpoint of change and continuity, thinking about that idea. And the reason we're going to do that is because, well, if we look at the way it's phrased and the way the College Board wants us to look at it and the way they're going to ask us about it, it's a lot of change and continuity. So we're going to talk about what change and continuity is. We're going to talk about what labor systems are. We're going to unpack a learning objective and see how it could be very easily turned into a question, and then how our historical developments from the key concepts, that content that we're trying to learn and memorize and know our definitions for, we'll look and see how that can form the answer to these questions. And so that's what it's all about, making sure that we understand these larger trends and can do this tough historical thinking and demonstrate that on a high level. So let's go ahead and get started. And first, talking about changes and continuities. So when we think about change and continuity, just remember that changes usually seem pretty easy, right? If I say what changed in history, you think, well, this is how things were, and this is how things were later on, and we know there might have been some event that caused it, right? They seem relatively easy. We are trained to identify change. We're actually a lot of times trained not even to like it very much. But you know, if you're looking, even from a young age, you know, you're asked to look at a picture. What are the 5 things that are different from one picture to the other? How often do they say, what are the 5 things that remain the same in a picture? So we tend to have a strong content knowledge base that helps us identify changes. But continuities, you know, that's something that we don't ask about. We're not asked about quite so much. You know, somebody might say, you know, how have you changed since you came to high school? But nobody says, how are you the same since you were in 4th grade? They can often be more difficult. Sometimes they're mundane and they seem just way too obvious. And sometimes we just don't give them a lot of emphasis. But in this course, we want to be intentional about committing some of these to memory. And in that way, we can prepare to be successful on the exam, especially in thinking about change and continuity, maybe even more than just here in labor systems across the course. Now, what about this term labor system? I find that when I introduce this term to my classes, it usually freaks people out right up front. Labor systems are found within kind of a theme or the strand of economics, the thematic focus of economic systems in our course. And so they certainly will have social effects. But when we talk about labor system, we're just really talking about methods of people working. And so we're going to look at a lot of examples of these. If we actually look back to our previous slide, we're going to talk about peasant labor today. We're going to talk about the Inca system, chattel slavery, indentured servitude, the Encomienda and Hacienda systems. All of these were ways of organizing labor, systems for organizing labor. Some were much more formal than others. Some were just happened to naturally develop, and some were quite insidious. So they run the gamut, but we're going to be talking about a good deal of them today. We'll start out with peasant labor momentarily. Now, when we're thinking about, why are we even approaching it in this way? Well, I want to show you why. And that's by unpacking a learning objective. Now, the course and exam description for AP World is kind of the holy book for this course. There is nothing that's going to be on your AP exam that is not brought up in this book. And you'll see in our presentations here on Fiveable, we oftentimes are organizing around these themes, and we're all getting it from the same place. This course and exam description, which you can find on the College Board website. In Unit 4, one of these learning objectives says to explain the continuities and changes in economic systems and labor systems from 1450 to 1750. Well, what this tells me is that this is a major idea or trend that we need to know from this time period, right? What's going on with economic systems? What's going on with labor systems? Of course, today we're focusing on the labor system aspect. But I want you to notice it's asking you to explain the continuities and changes, right up front. So it's really telling you, right away, this is an important historical skill that it wants you to be able to demonstrate, right? Identifying continuities, identifying changes across a broad period of time. In this case, 1450 to 1750. Of course, in this presentation, we're focusing on just this kind of second one, right? There are economic systems, and that's covered a great deal in maritime trade and lost my train of thought. Covered a lot in maritime trade and seeing how people interacted with each other around the world and overland trade and the like. But again, we're just going to focus on the second part, labor systems. So explain continuity and changes, labor systems, 1450 to 1750. We can take this learning objective and basically turn it into a prompt. So here's an FRQ prompt, for example, that takes a little bit of this learning objective and combines it with one of the historical developments, which we'll look at in a second. This is something I wrote earlier today, right? I just looked at the learning objective and I said, hey, what is it that we could be asked from this? So evaluate the extent to which the global economy transformed labor systems in the Americas, for example, in the period 1450 to 1750. Here, it's asking you about a transformation in labor system, right? Well, transformation, that is a word that indicates change, right? So it's basically asking you, evaluate the extent to which what was going on around the world and its economy, trade, interactions, whatever it might be, changed labor systems. And since you're evaluating the extent, it's thinking about a spectrum. How much did they change? How much did they stay the same, right? So you have that ability to talk about change and continuity. Now, this is an FRQ prompt. It could be an LEQ. You could just answer the question. Hopefully, when we get done with this, you can answer the question. But you could also, it might be paired, for example, with maybe a number of primary and secondary sources in a DBQ, right? So depending on how they wanted to do it. But nevertheless, if we look at this prompt, it is very similar to what our learning objective says. Now, we might get lucky, and it might even be more broad, because actually in this today, we're not going to just talk about the Americas. So it might look like evaluate the extent in which global economy transformed labor systems in the period 1450 to 1750. Heck, if that's on your AP exam, you're welcome. But it may very well could be as much as any of the other guy. In fact, in 2017, there was something about labor migrations that I nailed on the exam in prep. So let's look then at historical developments coming from this learning objective. Every learning objective has historical developments, and I've kind of moved some stuff together here. These are actually from two different learning objectives, but that were very similar. The other learning objective that goes along with this asks also about changes and continuities, but in peasant labor. So here are two historical developments dealing with labor systems. The first one, peasant and artisan labor continued and intensified in many regions as the demand for food and consumer goods increased. So I want you to pay attention to that idea, right? It continued, again, we're seeing that word, and intensified. Well, that intensified, that word there, that is a change, right? So here the historical developments are telling us specifically that this is what changed and what stayed the same, peasant and artisan labor. Those are our things. Now, where are our examples going to come from? Well, that comes from our learning. That comes from our reading, what we're doing in class, or what we're going to go over in this video. Another one of these objectives says, newly developed colonial economies in the Americas largely depended on agriculture, utilizing existing labor systems, their continuity, including the Encomienda, and introduced new labor systems, change, including chattel slavery, indentured servitude, Encomienda, and Hacienda. So if you're wondering where the things we're going over today come from, they all come from these historical developments. And these historical developments connect to our prompt, which comes from our learning objectives. Okay, so we're just turning those learning objectives into a question and using our historical developments to answer them. So let's go ahead and get started. And we're going to talk about, I say we get started as we're 15 minutes in, but we're going to talk about peasant agricultural labor here. That's really the first thing. And then we'll get into those labor systems in the Americas. So the first thing to understand, we're going to address changes first here with peasant agricultural labor. And our big change is that it intensified in many regions. All right. So I do have a question for you off the bat, just to kind of test your knowledge on the front end. So in the chat, if you haven't already introduced yourself, be sure to do so. First person to get the correct answer here gets a shout out. Question number one, which of the following countries used peasant labor to expand its empire by settling outlying territories? I'll wait while you guess for your answer. I see a couple answers coming in, China and France. All right, we'll see if anyone gets the shout out here. I like seeing the guesses. I know it's tough. I'm giving you the question beforehand, but we'll see how it goes. All right, so the answer here is Russia. We're going to talk about this now and how Russia used peasant labor and encouraged peasant labor in settling territories as they expanded their empire to the east. So we'll get to that momentarily. But if you got Russia as the right answer, Mauricio, with as many S's as you can put in Russia, nice job getting the answer there. So good to have you. So let's talk about some of these changes that we see in peasant agricultural labor. We're going to talk generally about it first, and then we'll look at 4 different examples: China, Mughal India, Russia, and Western Europe. So peasant agricultural labor is pretty much everywhere in the world. When we talk about peasant labor, we're just talking about the lower class farmers, peasant agricultural labor. These are the lower class farmers, most likely either very small landowners or people or peasant labor who rents land or works on land owned by someone else. What we see in this time period, and it's really interesting that you see can see in this map is, or this chart is, the rise. I'm realizing now this doesn't have a title on it, so I apologize that it doesn't. The rise in population in China and continental Europe, beginning in, well, the year 1000, but really that rise really kicking off in around the year 1500. So what you have in the world is mostly agricultural societies. We're not to the industrial age yet. And populations that when we get to this time period, 1450 to 1750, are going to start rising. And if you know this, you can put it in the chat. What do you think is the thing that leads to that population growth? And I'm thinking particularly around the year 1500. So right in here, we see kind of an uptick in growth in population of continental Europe as well as China. So there's something kind of unique to create that initial population growth. See if you can put it in the chat. And with the delay, see if you got it before I say it right now, which is after the Columbian Exchange, we start to see more diverse diets, people beginning to live, to be much healthier. Now we can go into some of the reasoning behind that. Also, there's during the Little Ice Age in Europe, they developed more sophisticated ways of farming. But what we start to see is population growth, population growth. So we get higher populations. Well, as more population, as our populations are growing, certainly you need more food, right, to feed those populations. This is kind of that positive feedback loop that we see every once in a while in history. You need more food, so thus you need more people to farm. More peasant farming leads to more food being available, which means populations are growing. We start to see somewhat exponential population growth, not like what we see in the modern day, but we're seeing definite growth across the world. And pretty much everywhere, this growing population that really kicks off after the Columbian Exchange will lead to an intensification of peasant agriculture. But it also leads to the intensification pretty much of all types of labor to meet demands. So let's start with China and just thinking about peasant labor in general. In China, we see that not only do we have a growth in population, so we see the intensification of peasant agriculture there, which we've already talked about. We also see trade increasing in this time period, and the demand for goods from China, particularly silk. And so what we see in China is really interesting, that China shifts a lot of its peasant labor force into the silk industry, right? There's high demand for silk, and so they shift people into working to produce that silk to meet the high demand. In this image, you see a really great example of peasants making silk cloth and kind of spinning the silk thread. I think right here they're it looks like they're boiling the cocoons of these silkworms in order to begin to unravel them and spin to thread. So that's a very labor-intensive process. Remember, this is not an industrial process. You need people working on this. And so ultimately, we see in China, to meet demand for trade that is coming about in this time period, more people moving into that industry. Now, while that's happening, keep in mind, there's also that what we already talked about with agricultural labor intensifying in China as well. Now, in Mughal India, it is somewhat similar. In China, there's a demand for silk. In India, there is a major demand for another textile, and that is cotton. People in Europe are trading, really kind of loving this fabric, so they're trading for it. Cotton is an agricultural product, much like, I guess you could say silk. I don't know if silk would count as an agricultural product. It's not out of the ground, but it definitely is natural. So somebody can answer that in here. Um, in Mughal India, under the Mughal Empire, they saw that cotton production was a major source of revenue because it was something that people wanted and could be traded far and wide. And so Mughal India forces peasants into growing cotton, kind of forcing them out of growing perhaps other crops in favor of growing what is ultimately kind of a cash crop for India. And so this is going to be an intensification of this specific type of peasant agriculture production in India. Again, it is in response to changes in the way people consumed goods and services around the world. As Europeans enter the Indian Ocean, trade intensifies, and both in China and India, they need labor to meet the demands of that trade. All right. Now, what about Russia? Now, this goes to our question that we had. So you may be wondering how the heck you got that one wrong. You'd never heard of that. Hopefully you will eventually. So in Russia, it was really interesting because settling land and farming was one way that you can make your mark on a territory and claim a region. Think about Europeans settling the Americas. In the Caribbean, they were building plantations. The earliest settlers of the United States in Virginia and Massachusetts, they were farmers, right? You go, you take ownership of that land, you work that land, you get that land ready to produce, and all of a sudden it is yours. It belongs to your empire. So Russia did this. Now, Russia was primarily centered in Eastern Europe, but as they expand to their east, they began to encourage peasant farmers to settle further and further into Asia and even as far into Siberia. And in this way, Russia began to expand their empire. Eventually, by, I want to say 1760 or so, having an empire that spread to the Pacific Ocean. Don't quote me on that date, though, because I forgot to include the map in here that shows that expansion. So I apologize about that. But Russia definitely expands eastward, and they use that frontier settlement to control that land. They did it with peasant farmers. They also do it with fur trappers and the like, and then they make sure that they can sell these furs, which are going for a lot of money. But they have claim to that land, eventually even jumping across the Bering Strait and claiming Alaska, but that's not part of this today. Now, in Western Europe, we also see this type of peasant labor intensifying as especially Western European populations grow. And then as they begin to expand, and we see the migrations of agricultural laborers into the Americas, particularly into the Caribbean and to South America, although then slavery will become the main source of agricultural labor there. But even in New England, for example, in North America, we see agricultural laborers moving to make a life for themselves. But in Western Europe, they're also producing things like wool and linen that are meeting demands of the era. So those are some examples from the course and exam description of peasant agricultural labor intensifying. So if we think about this as a change, right? How, going back to our question, how did labor systems change? Well, you could talk about how peasant agriculture intensified. And then here are 4 different examples, really 5, because pretty much everywhere we see needing more food. Pretty much everywhere in all of these examples, we see intensification of labor. You don't have to know every single example, but if you have 2 or 3 examples, you're going to have a really strong paragraph to talk about changes in peasant labor. But what if you wanted to talk about things that stayed the same, right? Continuities in peasant agricultural labor. Well, you could simply talk about how agricultural labor was the dominant form of labor in the pre-industrial world. Post-feudal free peasant farmers in Europe existed at the beginning of this time period. It existed at the end of this time period, right? We are talking about a world that is not industrial. We're not going to see people, specializing in very specific services. People were farmers. That is what most everyone did. Even though the bureaucrats in China get a lot of attention, and the merchant traders in India and east coast of Africa and get a lot of attention, and even all these conquistadors of Spain, we are in a world of pre-agricultural or pre-industrial agricultural labor. So that is going to be one of the continuities that you might want to note alongside the changes or the transformations if you were to write this essay. So hopefully by going over these examples of peasant agricultural labor, you will remember just one or two of them. And as Mr. Beckman here in the chat has mentioned, I'll reiterate it again, you don't have to know everything, but you need to know representative examples of these trends. And given examples of the trends, you might need to be able to recognize them. All right. So moving on from there, let's talk about probably what you expected to hear, I know, in this presentation, which is thinking about coerced labor and thinking about those labor systems that we're familiar with in the Americas, particularly that come out of this time period with colonization of North and South America and the Caribbean. So we're going to talk about coerced labor. And this term, coerced labor, means labor or work that is gained through the use of force or threats, where it is either non-free or pretty much non-free labor. So that's what we're talking about here. And that's different from free peasant labor, which could be paid wages or people working for themselves. So your question here to kind of preview, let's see how you do. Which of the following coerced labor system was outlawed by Spain in 1542 because it was deemed to be too cruel? I'll wait while you put your answers in the chat. All right, got a couple answers coming up here. Don't be shy. Go ahead and throw your answer up. There's no need to worry if you're going to be wrong. That's part of the fun. All right, let's see. I'll give you a little bit longer. I know there's a little bit of a delay, so when I move on to the next slide, I know that some people will still be inputting their answers. Feel free to take your time as you need. Give you a few more seconds. All right. So the correct answer here is C, the Encomienda system. Chattel slavery, which we'll talk about in a little bit, the kind of slavery that we had in the United States that was present in the Caribbean and the Americas, that is not outlawed, of course, in the United States until 1865, but it is not outlawed in Brazil until the 1880s, actually. So it sticks around a lot longer than 1542. Indentured servitude kind of disappears, but after chattel slavery goes away, it makes a comeback. But the Encomienda system is what is deemed just to be too cruel. And so there's a lot of lobbying against it. Although some people who lobby against it say this system should not be used. Instead, we should use slaves, which is not better. What can you do? So let's talk about coerced labor. And first, I want to just talk about some continuities, especially when we think about slavery. In this time period, 1450 to 1750, slavery is not a new invention. The slave trade, the use of slaves had existed for as much of world history as we have written about. It's mentioned in the earliest laws of Mesopotamia, and it is a continuity throughout most of history. And the African slave trade is a continuity in this time period. Although we are going to see a particular change about the size and the scope and where it is going. But one continuity that we see in labor systems in this time period, especially in coerced labor, is that slavery in Africa, in the slave trade from Africa, continued. Slaves that were traded from Africa, oftentimes into the Mediterranean region, into the Indian Ocean, to the Middle East, They worked within households. So we're not talking about cash crop plantation agriculture. And this slave trade that goes into the Indian Ocean or into the Mediterranean does not stop with the rise of the Atlantic slave trade, but it is very quickly passed in numbers. It really does not take long to surpass the numbers. The slave trade from Africa into those regions just pales in comparison to the demand for African slaves growing sugarcane, for example, in the Caribbean. So that's going to be one thing that we were talking about, that we'll talk about. There is a question in the chat that asks, was this due to the fact that the demand for goods from trade routes? And yes, it's really those cash crops. Sugarcane is going to be the main thing. And to another great extent, not quite equal extent, tobacco as well. But sugarcane and the demand for sugar around the world is really going to drive the increase in the Atlantic slave trade. But I'll get back to that momentarily. Good question. Thank you, Maya. So when we think about changes here, so that was kind of one continuity in coerced labor that I've given you there, right? Let's think about some changes. All of the changes we're going to talk about in coerced labor are in response to that growing demand for goods and labor coinciding with this intensification of trade. So are you seeing how like, man, Maya was like ahead of the game here, which is really great. Mauricio, thank you for encouraging. That was a really great question. So what we see here is in this world, 1450 to 1750, remember that we have this intensification of trade. We have a global trade going on. So more goods are going to be created because more people can get goods from further away and they're trading more, and more trade begets more trade. And you have ships going all over the world and trying to get at new materials. But you also need people to make these goods, especially agricultural goods. What was paying for all this? Well, silver was paying for all this. And the largest supplies of silver that had been discovered in this era were in the Americas. They were discovered by Spain in Mesoamerica and South America, places like Potosi in South America. And so, getting these resources out and available for trade took a great deal of labor. And so all of these labor systems we're going to talk about are really going to be occurring because of this growing demand for goods. And of course, the labor that produces those goods because of our intensifying trade. So think about those connections across time. And one reason I bring this up is because when you're writing your LEQ, or let's say this is an LEQ prompt, if you're writing this, not only are you asked to give evidence, to say what a change is and give evidence for why that change occurred, but you're also asked to explain not just the evidence, but why this change occurred over time, right? So why is there a growth in slavery? Because there was a demand for goods that required a great deal of laborers to grow sugarcane. Why was there a continuity in peasant agriculture? Because the world was still largely agricultural and it was meeting the demands of a growing population. So that extra explanation is really what sets essays apart instead of just being a laundry list of evidence. So let's get into the evidence, right? Now that we know kind of what is driving these changes. So I'm going to first talk about the Encomienda and Hacienda system here. When the Spanish arrived in the Americas, they began their conquest with these conquistadors. The Encomienda system that is implemented is these conquistadors conquer land and then take it over and begin to use the land to produce on these massive plantations, which are called haciendas. This was a continuation of a Spanish system that had been in place in our previous time period. Basically, the Spanish had been fighting wars to reconquer Spain from Muslim forces. Catholic Spain fighting against Muslims in what was called the Reconquista, or the reconquering of their territory. And as they conquered each bit of land, the leaders, these military leaders, were granted land by the crown. And whoever lived on that land, if they were Muslims, it was the responsibility of these conquerors to take care of those people and teach them how to be Christian. And as a result, in exchange, those people would provide free labor to the conquistadors on that land. So that system and that kind of tradition, I guess you could say, of conquering continues in the Americas. As Cortez conquers the Aztecs and other conquistadors conquer territory throughout Central America and then later South America, the lands they conquer become their own. They're given grants to this land, and the labor, the people who live on the land, become their free labor. Now, in exchange, the Spanish are supposed to treat them well, and they're supposed to teach them to speak Spanish and teach them Christianity, and as the Spanish would probably say, to civilize these people. But that was not exactly what was happening. Instead, what we saw was pretty much a system of brutal slavery taking place. And very early on, in the early 1500s, there are people like Bartolomeu de las Casas, a priest who had worked with peasants and seen their plight, who was writing back to the crown saying, this is a cruel system. This is a brutal system that is not teaching people to be Christian. It is only encouraging cruelty from the landowners to their forced labor. It needs to be done away with. And Spain does technically abolish it. They get rid of it. And that encomienda labor had been, working in agriculture, in some cases in mining. And instead it is replaced with a system called the Hacienda system. And basically this just means a plantation labor system where some people were paid wages, although oftentimes very low, although there was still examples of unpaid labor on these plantations as well. More where people are living on the land and owe labor to the hacienda owner. Hacienderos, I think, is or haciendados, dados, I think, is the official name for them in Spanish. But this system was extremely cruel. Again, just kind of keep in mind, in theory, the encomienda system was a colonial system. You get labor from the locals in return for teaching them Spanish and Catholicism. In practice, it was a brutal system that did neither of those things well, and eventually was outlawed and replaced with alternative systems. Now, in South America, we have something that is sort of a continuity, but it's also a new system to the Spanish, and that is the Mita system. So the Mita system is adopted from the Inca Empire, which is in South America in the Andes Mountains. And the Inca Empire used this system, and oftentimes you see it stylized as MIT''A when we talk about it with the Inca Empire. The Inca Empire used this. It was basically a form of labor as a tax. So instead of paying the government a certain amount of your money, you would owe the government a certain amount of labor each year. So if I owned a farm in my village, I or one of my children might go for 2 months out of the year and work on a public works project or work on a government-owned farm. That was how you paid your taxes to the state, through your labor. And so the Mita system was in place with the Inca when the Spanish arrived. In fact, the image that you see here is an illustration from a book by a guy named Felipe de Ayala, a book where it's called The First New Chronicle in Good Government, and it's about the government of the Inca Empire. Felipe de Ayala, that was a Spanish name that his family had taken. He came from a noble Incan family. And it was actually a book that was written for the Spanish king because he wanted some reforms to happen in the Spanish-controlled areas of South America. But what he writes about in his book are the governmental processes, and he talks about this Mita system. The image that you actually see here is of a very different way than we might think of it. We think, oh, if I have to do labor as a tax, man, that's brutal. Like, how brutal were they? But what he chose to emphasize was that there were that the Inca treated their laborers well. Now, when the Spanish adopt this system and basically say, hey, there's a system in place, we're going to use it. Well, they aren't known for treating their workers well. So De Ayala in this image was showing that there were monthly celebrations where the peasants who were working for the government were being fed, and workers who were especially productive were recognized for their service to the state and to the government, which is kind of interesting to think about. And as this is how they, paid their tax. But since that system was already in place and there was a way for the government to extract labor from the masses, when the Spanish come in, they say, well, don't reinvent the wheel. We're going to use this. And they decide that they can use this same system primarily in the mining of silver. The Spanish discover massive quantities of silver in the Andes Mountains, particularly at this location, which you see on the map on the image here, at this place called Potosi, which was, for all intents and purposes, a mountain of fairly pure silver, which produced enough silver that it became a global currency around the world, the Spanish peso de ocho. And to extract that silver from the land, they used the Inca Mita system. They required these people they had conquered in the conquest of South America to work for them in extremely dangerous conditions in mines under brutal circumstances to get that silver ore, so that they could then mint coins and go around the world and buy the things they wanted, and be very powerful. And they did it very successfully. But again, it was a new way of using coerced labor. It took an old system, so we kind of have that continuity of the system, but changed for the Spanish's purpose. And so keep that in mind. For the Inca, it was labor for the greater good. The Spanish, it was mostly labor for the crown of Spain to mine silver and make them very rich. Now, a new system of labor that is important that comes out of this time period is something called indentured servitude. Indentured servitude, this system of coerced labor develops out of a need for agricultural labor when the Americas are being settled, especially in the growing of tobacco and initially the growing of cotton in the Caribbean and North America. Indentured servitude consisted mostly of Europeans, which in contrast to the Encomienda and Mita system consisted mostly of Native Americans. The indentured servitude was a system of temporary labor. And in that system of temporary labor, people would, a landowner or someone who is wealthy would pay for the passage of a person from Europe to the Americas in exchange for a labor for a certain amount of time. So they would sign a contract that was called their indentures, which would make them a servant of this person who paid their way. Upon completion of the contract, typically that person had a skill, and if they were coming to be an artisan, or they were given an attractive land if they came over as agricultural labor. So they literally worked off their labor. The problem is indentured servants are not treated quite very well either. There's an epidemic of indentured servants running away, which of course is very costly for someone who's already paid their passage over. In some cases, they are treated quite poorly by their masters, the people who hold their contracts and indentures. Sometimes their indentures or their contracts are sold between people, and so they jump from one to another until they end up working those indentures off. It is a system that is very popular for a short time, but eventually will disappear in favor of a system of labor that is much more insidious and much more brutal. And that is chattel slavery, the system of slavery that we know in the Americas. One of the reasons why indentured servitude becomes so difficult to maintain is because people realize the labor is hard in the Americas. People do not want to go sign up to go work in sugar plantations in the Caribbean. It's hot. It's dangerous. You can get sick and die very easily. Lifespans were very short. So if you can't get people to sign up, how do you fill that demand for labor? Well, the answer for Europeans was to not ask, to not pay for people to come over, not pay people to come over, but instead kidnap them and force them into labor. And that system that becomes prominent is chattel slavery. This term, chattel slavery, is what we use to denote that the slaves that were used in the Americas, in this specific labor system, they were property. Chattel is simply property. Oftentimes you might hear the term chattel used when talking about livestock, right? A farmer's chattel, like his cows or his oxen or his pigs or whatever it might be. It is his property. And so in this system, people were seen as property. The growth of chattel slavery from 1450 or from roughly 1500 to the end of this time period and beyond is the single biggest change in coerced labor in this time period. If you got this essay and it asks you about changes and continuities in labor from 1450 to 1750, I would expect any of my students to write about the growth of slavery, or you could say the explosion of slavery in this time period. And this chart, this bar graph, really does a good job of showing this. The number of slaves imported from Africa every 25 years. And you can see not until after 1600 does the number cross 250,000, but it very quickly is over 1 million, right? 250,000 takes 100 years. 100 years later, we're over 1 million slaves per 25-year period, which is important. It's not total, it's per 25-year period. And reaching a peak of over 2 million slaves between 1776 and 1800. Just massive amounts of slaves coming to the Americas, primarily to the Caribbean and Brazil, but a large number also to North America and what will become the United States. Mostly growing sugarcane, but also other cash crops like indigo and tobacco. Not so much cotton in this time period, but once you get to if you can see my pointer here, once you get into the Industrial Revolution in the early 1800s, cotton will become a major driver of the growth of slavery in the United States. So let's talk a little bit more about chattel slavery. It is the Atlantic slave trade, which brings slaves from Africa to the Americas. It is a forced migration, right? This is not something that people in Africa were given a choice to do, right? They're being sold into slavery. Typically, these slaves were taken as a result of warfare or illegal slave trade, warfare that was exacerbated by Europeans bringing in European weapons and encouraging this warfare because they were paying for slaves with goods made in Europe. And so the fact that there was a demand for slaves leads to the growth of that industry in West Africa, particularly. So the biggest connection here to understand, if we're thinking about, well, why does slavery grow so much, is that connection to the sugar plantations. And you can see that in this image here, as you see slaves chopping sugar cane. It was a very labor-intensive work. And this has major impacts on demographics in the Americas and in Africa, right? So if we think about all of the repercussions of this labor system, we have to understand that in the Americas, this leads to a growing population of African ancestry in the Caribbean, especially as basically Europeans had completely eliminated Native Americans in the region. Some Native American groups and cultures go completely extinct. But we also see changes in demographics in Latin America. In the Spanish-controlled colonies, we see a lot more ethnic groups mixing together, living amongst each other, having children together. That is not going to be the case so much in North America. There's also going to be changes in demographics in Africa. Most of the slaves brought over to the Americas were men. And so we're going to see gender imbalances for a good amount of time in West Africa. And so the gender roles there will change as women take on more responsibilities, especially in agricultural labor in West Africa. For a time, there certainly will be, and in some communities, depending on where you're looking, there are population drops due to the rise in the demand of slaves in the slave trade. But over time, those will correct themselves, mainly because of more nutritious foods and people living longer and population generally growing all over the world. But one thing that we notice is that while populations are growing at one rate all over the world, they're growing at a much slower rate in Africa because of this brutal system of slavery, where as many as a quarter of slaves on a slave ship could die on the way to the Americas. And once they reached the Americas, the death rates were extremely high. It was very common for slave ships not to be bringing more slaves to the Americas necessarily, but to bring replacements for slaves who had died because of the brutal conditions under which they lived and worked, especially in the Caribbean on sugar plantations. So I know that's a lot, but just kind of keep those things in mind. Certainly, if we want to think kind of beyond labor systems into maybe how this changed social structures, there are kind of further changes that we could think about, right? You could have a question, an LEQ that says, explain how labor systems led to changes in social structures. And so here's how we might address that. We see new class systems emerge in the Americas, especially in Spanish America. In Spanish America, we start to see the Casta system emerge, where we see a kind of a social hierarchy of European-born Spaniards of pure European ancestry who were born on the land, Peninsulares, who were at the top of the chain, then European Spaniards who were born in the Americas would be next, the Creole class, and then mixes of social classes. Mestizos, which would be mixes of Europeans and Native Americans, mulattoes, Europeans and Africans, and then on down the line, basically ending with slaves at the very bottom of that hierarchy, African slaves at the bottom of the social pyramid. And that is in Spanish America, but it's also across all of the Americas, in North America, in British-held North America as well. African slaves occupy the bottom of the social pyramid. And so this goes hand in hand with their role as owned agricultural labor. In this, I don't think I can overstate it enough, this brutal system. So question number 3, I think I may have given it away. Let's see who is still paying attention. Which class was considered the highest in the Casta system of Spanish America? Maya already in real quick, out of a holster there. Let's see if she's right. Let's see, do other people agree with Maya? We disagree? Go ahead and put your answer in when this gets caught up. Agree. All right. Mauricio says she's correct. Amundo. Excellent. Good. Look at all the friends we're making today. Yes, Maya is correct. Peninsulares at the top, followed by the Creoles, mestizos, and mulattoes below them. So that is the highest caste that we see. Now, we've basically reached the end of this presentation. Man, I'm like right at an hour, which I'm very proud of myself. But I'm also here to still answer any of your questions. So if you have any questions, go ahead and put it in the chat. But I do want to go back and just recap a little bit about what we looked at today. The first thing we talked about was that there was change in the continuities as a major thing that we have to learn and know how to write about in AP world. So we talked about changing the continuities. We talked about what labor systems are. It's not a term to be scared of if you know some examples. Okay, so don't be scared of that term. It is what it says. It is how people performed labor, peasant agriculture or coerced labor, and of course the many different types. We looked at how a question might be built using learning objectives, right? So if you go to the course and exam description, you can go through these learning objectives or ask your teacher about them. They can point you to the right place, and you can craft questions from those, especially study questions. If you can answer those turn those learning objectives into questions and answer them, then you will know more than you need to for this exam. And there are a lot of learning objectives, so you would take it unit by unit. And then we talked about a lot of these different labor systems and how they changed, and in some ways how they stayed the same, focusing on the peasant labor, Mita, slavery, for most of the last part, indentured servitude, and then those Encomienda and Hacienda systems. So hopefully that was really clear to you, and you have an idea of, heck, maybe this becomes a question that you see on a test, whether your teacher's test or you see on the AP exam, and you feel confident about answering it. So I really hope that it is beneficial for you. I'll hang on for a minute or two. If you have any questions, tell me to pause, and I'll be happy to answer them. But it was really, really great to have everybody in the chat and participating in the chat. If you like what we did here tonight, share it with your friends. Remember, these live sessions are absolutely free to anybody. So we want to get as many people into these live sessions as possible. Of course, if you want to become a member of Fiveable, you'll have access to all our past sessions, some that I've done on China so far this year, and of course, a good deal of others. And I can't even remember all that we've done so far this year, but man, there's a lot. Did one on Hunter on the Neolithic Revolution, all sorts of stuff. So we have a great library for you. But definitely, please share what we're doing here with your friends. We want as many people to enjoy the live, free stuff as possible. And if you want to know what's coming up next, click that green button at the bottom to save your spot for an upcoming live review. Invite a friend to join with you. And that way you can communicate in the chat, and maybe two of you will enjoy what we have in our next session. I don't see any questions popping up, so I'm going to go ahead and end our broadcast. It was really great to be with you all tonight, and hopefully you know a little bit more about labor systems in the early modern world. You have a great evening, everybody.